So good morning, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Digital Law News. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. This podcast is produced by Anson Evaluate, and I will be filling in for Laura this week. So I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright, and we're just going to run through some news stories which have been coming up this week. I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Thanks very much, Amelia, and welcome. And yes, we've got some interesting stories to look at this week. Turns out lots of people and countries are being hacked, and some of other interesting bits with regards to data protection enforcement to look at as well. So quite a few stories to flick through, so I'll hand over back to you.
Okay, so our first story for this week is based in Iran. So earlier this week, Iran faced cyber attacks on petrol stations throughout the country, and this attack hits their internet-based system, which lets motorists buy subsidised fuel with government-issued smart cards. This caused long queues at petrol stations because most people in Iran are dependent on the subsidised fuel. So I will pass over to Peter to kind of discuss this further.
Thank you very much, Amelia. And yeah, this is really an example at the moment of if you really want to hit a country where it hurts, you do it through energy and fuel distribution, because global supply chains at the moment are not in a good place in countries all over the world as the global economy tries to come back from the COVID lockdowns. And of course, some countries are still locked down, others are not, and others are gradually emerging, and it's creating real problems. There is a global energy shortage, and therefore, if you want to cause problems, you are going to actually attack the way that that energy is distributed. And that's exactly what this group called Predatory Sparrow appears to have done. Iran is looking at this as being an attack by a foreign country, though it is interesting that the hackers also have ended up compromising digital billboards at various sites around the highways in Tehran and other big cities with messages that are against the regime, or certainly questioning the regime, asking the supreme leader, where is our fuel, for example. I think the other thing to take away from this is actually how successful this attack appears to have been. Iran has 4,300 petrol stations, and only 5% of those stations have currently been reconnected and are back online. So in a country that I think is very reliant on the motor car and is therefore reliant on fuel, this is a major issue for Iran in terms of the protection of its critical national infrastructure. And clearly it's going to take a long time to get this system back up and running and getting the subsidised fuel available for the public again.
Precisely, and as well, I think it does, in fact, kind of strike us a little bit ironic after the current atmosphere in not just the UK but across the world with the fuel shortages as well. So continuing with the kind of theme of hacks, earlier this week, the Tesco website and app faced a potential hack, and so the retail giant services crashed on Saturday, and while they're now up and running again, we're yet to fully understand what had really happened here.
Yes, this is a very interesting story, given that Tesco saw a massive expansion of its sales during the pandemic in 2020, and that has continued in 2021. And the proportion of their sales that were internet-based, in terms of people buying products online to have them delivered at home, roughly doubled during the first period of the lockdown. So they've had to invest in a big way to expand the capabilities of their website to allow people to order products and have them delivered to home. And the fact that the site was taken down, the fact that it happened on a Saturday, which is going to be one of the busiest days, is a major problem for them. Tesco also, of course, is a big provider of fuel. They have petrol stations on all of their forecourts, and people very often rely on the app, even if it's just to have their Tesco club card on there, so they can go and have that scanned when they are paying in person at the supermarket, let alone if it comes down to the online deliveries. And it's thankfully they got everything back up and running fairly quickly in a few hours. But when so much business is funneled through those online apps and through the website, they will have lost significant business. And it's also, of course, affects people's confidence in Tesco. So some customers might say, well, hang on, I was affected by this. I badly needed to order something and I wasn't able to do so. Or they may have ordered something and then not received confirmation, not had the delivery. It just leads to frustration and leads to an erosion of confidence by consumers in the service. So it'll be interesting to see how they then come back from that problem in terms of how they work with their customers to restore their faith in Tesco.
Exactly, and I know if it were me, given the hysteria that's been surrounded by COVID, with people not being able to access certain foods, and equally taking into consideration the kind of supply chain issues with food at the moment as well, I can definitely understand where people might think, oh crikey, I'm not sure I have as much faith in these services as I used to.
Indeed, people are already struggling with, in some instances, empty shelves at supermarkets or items that they can't otherwise get in a delivery. So a general level of frustration that some consumers will understandably have anyway is then exacerbated by a major outage like this. And it does indeed, as you say, Millie, add to that sort of general unease at the moment with regards to global supply chains and the problems that is wreaking. And this is one major aspect of that.
So again, continuing with cyber attacks, there has been a mass of unprecedented cyber attacks across the UK internet phone providers, and these were targeting voice over internet protocol, VoIP services. So according to an industry body, several of its members have been targeted by distributed denial of services attacks in recent weeks. So DDoS attacks they work by flooding websites or online services with internet traffic in an attempt to throw us offline or make it inaccessible. So I'll pass over to Peter to continue going through this.
Yeah, thank you, Amelia. This is, I mean, it's interesting. We always hear a lot about malware and ransomware attacks, and this, of course, is one of the more traditional denial of service attacks, whereby a provider is that their websites, their servers are flooded with inquiries. The idea is the system can no longer cope with the inquiries, it falls over, and then sometimes as a result that server or that network could then be compromised and personal data could be compromised. Has that happened in this instance? We don't know yet. I should add as well that with our previous story on Tesco, we don't know, for example, if their system was compromised, if any personal data was breached during that attack. That will only come out in the future weeks and months as they investigate and indeed report that to the Information Commissioner's Office, the UK regulator, if indeed that's what's happened. In this instance, it is worrying, I think, for the UK government that this has happened. There is a government agency that protects critical national infrastructure that is supported through cooperation with other agencies like the National Cybersecurity Centre, MI5, the other security services and law enforcement. The idea is to protect key items of infrastructure, everything from power stations to bridges, to ports, to airports, but also things like phone networks, as well as things like the electricity grid, the water grid, etc. So all of these things are supposed to be protective and to benefit from that interagency cooperation, and yet still something that we all rely on here increasingly, voice over internet protocol phone services, have been compromised. This is a major issue when it comes to data. Don't forget if those systems are compromised, details of people's phone records, their providers, their calls, their texts, their billing, how they pay for these services, could all have been compromised. Let's hope that that hasn't happened. But this is now part of the liaison between government, Ofcom, and the National Cybersecurity Centre, where they go and look into this along with the Centre for the Protection of Critical National Infrastructure, and try and work out what's happened, and also try and make sure it doesn't happen again.
Exactly, and I think the main part is the fact that they're working with the National Cybersecurity Centre, and we'll go on in the rest of this podcast to mention these again, because actually the National Cybersecurity Centre are working very hard to kind of produce a lot of guidance in regards to any sort of attack, and we'll touch on this later. So leading on from this story, so the big law firms are currently more concerned about cyber attacks than COVID. This is very much a bold statement. We all have had the hysteria of COVID over the last couple of years, and I think the fact that cyber attacks are concerning the biggest law firms around the world is a big statement. I'll pass on to Peter to go through this.
Yeah, thanks, Amelia. This is an interesting story from the Legal Futures website, which has publicised the PwC report that they do. They do an annual top 100 UK law firm summary. So they'll have looked at, the big UK law firms, Clifford Chance, Freshfields, as well as the other big players in that top 100. And they've said that 90% of respondents were extremely or somewhat concerned about the impact of cyber threats on their ability to deliver on their business plans and ambitions over the coming 12 months, even though only 4% of those top 100 firms have been on the receiving end of a cyber attack. And indeed, none of those 4% were actually in the top 50, but it's showing a high level of awareness and concern and general unease amongst the largest firms in the UK legal profession. And when we think that there's actually more concern there than over COVID, I mean, we've all seen the problems from COVID, the problems of establishing working from home, which has been a major challenge for law firms to be able to have that manner of distributed working, to be able to support their workforce, to be able to continue to support their clients, to turn around services at a time of very difficult, unprecedented conditions that we've all had to deal with. The fact that a cyber attack is seen as a bigger threat than COVID and the threat of greater lockdowns or restrictions, I think shows that certainly the leadership of law firms are waking up to the risk and understanding that there is a need to be aware of this, a need to put resources into place to try and minimise that risk. And I think as well, I think there's a realisation amongst firms that because they've got such large numbers of their staff continuing to work from home, that does exacerbate the risk. People are outside of their firm's security measures and firewalls potentially when they're working from home. New starters during the last 2 years will not have had that intensive induction period that many firms would otherwise have provided, where people get an introduction to this is how you use our services and systems, this is how you look after personal data, this is how you minimize risk. In a lot of instances, death by Zoom call is no substitute for sometimes being able to have that more hands-on training experience. So I think firms are realizing that they are vulnerable and continue to be vulnerable, and they're very much aware of this. I think in many ways, while this is a worrying highlight, I think it is a good thing that actually firms are realizing and waking up to this risk.
Precisely, and I think the point worth mentioning as well here is 3/4 of cases cyber attacks are a result of unintentional actions by staff rather than malicious actions by staff. And I think that really proves the point that people do need training on this, because it is just as simple as copying someone in the wrong email, as we'll see later, which can actually have a massive knock-on effect to other parts of the business.
Exactly, and let's think about the current scenario. We've currently got a lot of people still working from home, and in a lot of places around the country, it's half-term week, so people are, pupils and are all at home as well, and as people are also trying to then work, and sometimes to difficult, demanding jobs that require concentration and attention to detail, and it can be difficult doing that. If you're in a very busy house and you don't necessarily have a room where you can close the door and focus on your work, if you're trying to do things from the kitchen table, and that's where the problems can sometimes start to arise.
Certainly, and I know we as a firm have received emails this week from a client apologising because they didn't quite manage to get back to us because of the fact that their children were at home during half term, which is a direct example of the fact that things can go slightly wrong when there is that distraction. So moving on to our next story, I mentioned earlier about the National Cybersecurity Centre, and this week they have released results from a survey from Ofcom stating that nearly 45 million people in the UK have been a target of scam text messages or phone calls in the last 3 months alone. And I think for me, 45 million is so much. It's such a large figure. But one of the most interesting factors is that there is actually kind of a difference in demographic targets. So people from 16 to 34 are targeted with text messages, whereas more over 75s have been receiving suspicious phone calls to their landline number. And I think this really does kind of demonstrate the difference between kind of the younger demographic and slightly older demographic.
Indeed, thanks, Amelia. And the thing here is, I think, is the sheer volume of people who are affected by this. I continue to think that if someone set up a political party that said we're going to get rid of and really combat the threat from online fraud, I think you'd win a massive majority because it's something that seems to affect everyone. We've always heard of the elderly often being targeted by this. Even my great aunt, who was in her 90s, she received a call at one point purportedly from HMRC saying, you haven't paid enough income tax, to which she said, well, I haven't worked for 40 years, young man. So she was, yeah, she knew it was a scam, but it was nonetheless a little bit confusing and bewildering for a 90-year-old. But the point here as well, it's not just the phone calls, it's the emails, and it's even the scam text messages that purportedly come from your bank or from your I've even had one saying, oh, your council tax hasn't been paid. And those sorts of things, when you receive them, can initially jolt you and you think, oh, what's this? And you take it at face value before you then stop and think, hang on, actually, no, I'm not awaiting a delivery from this purported company. I'm not, you know, there isn't an outstanding bill from XYZ here. But it's, you know, I think it's a shame that people have to have that level of wariness around every single communication that they receive. Amelia, I know that you actually put together a blog on our website on this, where you actually ended up receiving a scam, on the receiving end of a sort of scam text message that seemed very, very genuine and indeed appeared to come from an existing and verified trusted source.
Yeah, precisely. So I was sat at home the previous weekend and I received a text message from my mobile phone service provider, and it came through as a legitimate text chain. So where I previously just received a new phone, it followed the same text chain. And I was like, oh, okay, there's clearly something gone a bit wrong here. It does happen, you know, you change cards, something changes, and you do have to put in your card details. So I thought, okay, brilliant, that's probably what's happened. It's come through a legitimate source. Use the link, great, the link looked the same as what I usually go through to contact my service provider, and therefore I did fill in my online details. Little did I know it was indeed a scam, and not long after this transaction I had pending transactions on my banking account. Thankfully, I was able to get in touch with my bank and get it sorted reasonably stress-free. I say reasonably stress-free. I think if you've ever experienced any sort of fraud or scam, you will know stress-free is not really an option. Thankfully, I can inform you that I did receive all of the money back that had been taken from my account. But I work in a digital law account for a digital law firm. We go through this all the time. You'll have heard from our other podcasts. We're always talking about fraud and scam, and yet here I am, kind of feeling a bit silly really, and a bit sorry for myself because I had in fact fallen for a relatively easy scam.
Indeed, thanks, Amelia. And yeah, indeed, people can read about that in more detail on the website. I think the key takeaways from this survey are that as well, that 80% of those who are then on the receiving end, so 80% of that 45 million, do not know how to report a suspicious text message or phone call. So how should you do that? The NCSC have put together the guidance on this. You can forward a suspicious text message to 7726. If you receive a scam phone call, you should report it to Action Fraud. Action Fraud as well is in the process of being replaced by a new government agency that will deal with cyber fraud. So while it's Action Fraud at the moment, that may change in the course of the next few months, so keep an eye out on that. And if you receive an email, you can report it to the suspicious email reporting service at report@phishing.gov.uk. But all of that information is available from the NCSC website as well, where they've done some very detailed guidance on how to deal suspicious emails and text messages.
Indeed, and like Peter mentioned in my blog post, this will also go through in a little bit more detail the precise things that happened to me and then what action that I eventually took. So the next story again is an ICO warning after the Scottish charity reveals personal data in an email error. This comes quite similarly after last week's podcast, I believe, that was discussed about the MOD and an error in their own email system. So the ICO are urging organisations to revisit their bulk email practices after failures by HIV Scotland led to a £10,000 fine. I will pass over to Peter to kind of go through the rest of this with you.
Thanks, Amelia. Yeah, I think it's worrying here, first of all, that a charity who's clearly going to be handling from its very name is going to be handling very sensitive personal data. The fact that then they had already been told you need to buck up your act when you're handling this data appeared not to listen to the message and has ended up being fined £10,000. I think the thing to listen to the spot here isn't the size of the fine. I mean, for a charity, that's not great that they will lose that. It's more the fact that the ICO has had to take this level of enforcement against a charity because of clearly persistent failings in terms of how they're handling personal data. It got to the point that all email addresses on an email to 105 people were visible to all recipients, and 65 of those email addresses had people identified by their full name. So from that, you could then make an assumption that if you are the recipient of that email from that charity and what it was discussing, you could then discern what their HIV status or risk was. And already there had been an ICO investigation on this that identified the fact that they were not sending bulk emails like this correctly, they were not using the BCC function correctly, and they had an inadequate data protection policy, which really is not good enough. If an organisation, you know, at the point where HIV Scotland was set up and was then operating like this, they should have had a bulletproof data protection policy and then continue to review and update that as a matter of course, given the very sensitive nature of the data. You know, we're talking here about very vulnerable people who do not really need to be made even more vulnerable through the actions of a charity that's supposed to be supporting them. And therefore, that's why I think the ICO has felt they have no option here, but unfortunately to make the enforcement that they have.
Precisely, and kind of continuing with sensitive data that may or may not have been somewhat misused, ministers are facing a high court battle over their use of WhatsApp. So the government could be forced to crack down on their use of WhatsApp and private email accounts if the High Court challenge succeeds in this. So legal campaigners have been granted a judicial review of the official guidance, which they allege has been unclear and routinely ignored.
Yes, thank you, Amelia. This is a story with regards to the fact that government ministers for a long time now have ended up using private email accounts, things like Gmail, etc., to actually end up carrying out government business, as well as WhatsApp. Dominic Cummings, who was one of the Prime Minister's senior advisors during the pandemic, ended up taking screenshots of an awful lot of those discussions that he had confidentially with the Prime Minister that took place through WhatsApp. And those screenshots have now been leaked, surprise, surprise. And indeed, he's actually got them up on his own Twitter account and on his Substack. And he's even charging people to take a look at it. Very thoughtful. I'm not sure how that gets around the Official Secrets Act exactly, but the whole point is that things like platforms like WhatsApp are not intended for business use. They should not be being used to run the country. They certainly should be being used to have confidential discussions that could include discussions of classified information as well as personal data. And in this instance, when you're looking at the operation of the country and indeed the operation of the country during the time of a global pandemic. The point here, above all, is that the government has secure systems to allow for communications. The only reason why politicians, advisors, etc., might be avoiding using those secure systems is so that they can then try and circumvent an FOI request. So if there is an FOI request made, searches are carried out of business, government .gov.uk email accounts and communications channels, and that is what that would then be disclosed pursuant to the FOI request. And in that way, advisors and ministers are thinking, if we use our private communication systems, we are then getting round that net that is cast in answering the FOI request. But in fact, you're putting that information at risk. And the big issue here is that if you are discussing information like, say, the vaccine response, or even the development of that vaccine, or you're discussing how you're supporting businesses, or you're discussing travel criteria, as well as any other sensitive government discussions, if you want to make that easily accessible by a foreign actor, a foreign nation state, doing it on WhatsApp or your private email account is definitely the way to do it. So you're just giving away potentially government information secrets. And that is the real problem with this. And that's where we're going to need stronger action in future.
Precisely. And before we move on from this, Peter, can you just clarify to those who don't know what an FOI request is? Because as a law firm, we do actually deal with a various amount of FOI requests.
Indeed. So the Freedom of Information Act 2000 is the act that allows individuals to make requests of public sector bodies, and that means that certainly all government departments are covered by this legislation, as well as local authorities and the majority of government agencies and regulators. And an FOI request, when made, means that that organisation is then required to carry out a search that then means that that information could be disclosed to anyone who who makes that request. It is a popular tool used by journalists in particular to carry out research and get information for stories, but ultimately any private UK individual can make an FOI request of a body that is subject to the legislation. And there is a massive long list of these specific bodies that are covered by the legislation appended to the Act.
Perfect. Thank you, Peter, for clarifying that one. So our final story for today, I don't think after last week that we can go another podcast without mentioning Facebook. So Facebook have decided to change their name to Meta in a major rebrand. So the company would say it would better encompass what it does as it broadens its reach beyond kind of social media into areas like virtual reality. I'll leave this one for you, Peter.
Thank you, Amelia. And I think the key thing here is that Facebook is currently receiving a lot of bad press. And everyone ends up referring to the fact that, it's Facebook that owns Instagram, it's Facebook that owns WhatsApp, and it's Facebook that has taken over companies like Oculus Rift for the, VR, etc. And I think by renaming the parent company as Meta, I think they're hoping to sort of divert some of the bad press that Meta could now receive, because it's being investigated on competition grounds both in Europe, in the UK, and in the US for some of its previous transactions when it's taken over some of these other organisations. And indeed, its wider practices and the infrastructure behind how Facebook operates and is regulated is also receiving a lot of attention. Now, Google did a similar thing in 2015. They made their parent company Alphabet, so it's Alphabet that owns Google and owns YouTube and owns various others. But I'm not sure that in public consciousness it's made an awful lot of difference, because I think the public probably still think, if it's Google that owns YouTube, it's Google that owns Google Maps and all of the other organizations that are part of the Google environment, from Google Earth to their various other services as well, as one of the world's largest corporations. And therefore, I think the attempt here by Mark Zuckerberg to try and detoxify the Facebook brand, I think this is a move that if it was going to be successful, had to have been done a long time ago. And it hasn't happened, and it's only doing it now. So I think it's a little too little too late, really, to try and detoxify the brand and stop any more if any more whistleblowers come forward and talk about Facebook putting profits over safety. If he's thinking, people are going to be talking about Meta putting profits over safety, I don't think that's going to be the case. People will still be referring to Facebook, and I think that the opportunity to sort of break that link, I'm afraid that ship has sailed some time ago.
Exactly. I mean, when I was going through this story, I noticed that Google had renamed its parent company to Alphabet, and I had absolutely no clue that they had a parent company called Alphabet. Like you say, most people, Google is Google. It's such a big tech giant that you wouldn't even think that it kind of had another name to it. And so that was our last story for today. So a big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this webinar. Anson Evaluate have a lot of useful guidance on their website as well as training. So like Peter mentioned, where organisations are in fact failing to provide this training, you could always come along to the website and we can indeed help you with this. Included within kind of the training, the next few weeks we'll be running some CPD courses, and I'll pass you over to Peter to talk about this in kind of more detail.
Thank you, Amelia. Yes, so we finally have a schedule available for our forthcoming CPD schedule. We're doing 10 one-hour-long webinars. The first 4 will be on cybersecurity. The second 4 will be on data protection, and then there will be a final block of 2 on social media law and regulation. We are offering individual webinars. Each one is £45, or you can then get the individual blocks in a bundle, or you can have all of those webinars in a block for £325. But listeners to this podcast can claim a special discounted rate of £300 for all 10 webinars. So when you think about it, £300 for 10 webinars, that means you're actually getting each webinar for £30 rather than the £45 charge on the face of it. So, and when you think about it, 10 hours worth of continuing professional development points and online training, that's a pretty good deal. So lots of information available on our website there with regards to the schedule. The first webinar on cybersecurity will be on the 17th of November.
That's great, thank you, Peter. And I believe you'll also be speaking at a few events over the next few weeks. Did you want to mention those as well?
Yes, I will be in London at the Excel Centre for the LegalX conference. I'm speaking at 11 AM on the 11th of November, Thursday 11th of November, and I'm talking about law tech providers and the things that we need to think about when law firms and indeed in-house departments might end up using law tech providers. What sort of questions should we ask when it comes to security, when it comes to how data is handled, and indeed what questions do you need to ask about some of the restrictive terms that might be in those contracts? So I'll be sharing a few bits of best practice and advice there during that session, and be great to see people there. If any of the it's free to register, free to go along to LegalX on that day, so just go along to just Google LegalX. You'll see all the information on there for the conference. You can register for free. Do feel free to come along and say hello if you're in the audience. But yes, that will be on the 11th of November. See you there.
Great, thanks, Peter, and thank you again to Anson Evaluate for producing this podcast. We will be back next week with hopefully another episode. Just a reminder for you, these episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel, and other podcast channels such as Spotify and Apple Music. Thank you again for listening, and we hope to see you again very soon. Bye for now.